Okay, welcome to the evening plenary, Peace Day. It's been an amazing day right around the world in so many different ways and so many different expressions. Really uplifting and incredible and moving. This evening plenary is dedicated to human security. It's the many dimensions of human security, part two. So I want to welcome back Jonathan Granoff. Welcome back to Peace Week, Jonathan.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for convening us from Australia to Northern California, and I'm in the center of New York City.
Wonderful. Well, it's a busy week in New York City. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that. And Peter Coyote, it's wonderful to meet you. I'm going to read a little bit about your bio in a moment, Peter, but just for now, happy International Day of Peace and welcome to Peace Week.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, a few days ago, we had a pretty amazing conversation between Jonathan Granoff and Deepak Chopra, which was part one of this discussion around the many dimensions of human security, from the deepest personal to the global. And it was a very rich dialogue in which the very idea of human security or security in general is being reimagined, expanded, and really becoming one of those portals into even whole systems transformation. Because once we start looking at human security, it's not long before we start looking at how we're treating the environment and everything else that is taking place. You know, the whole field of what needs to transform. So I think it's a very exciting discussion, particularly because it's a term that is used so widely inside the UN system. So as a way of engaging with the full force of the UN system, there is great potential in what you're doing, Jonathan, and with friends in redefining this term, re-expanding this term, reimagining this term. So we're going to dive in there. Let me just introduce Peter for those to whom they may not know Peter's rich background. Peter Coyote began his career as a film actor and narrator at 39 after a dozen years in the counterculture of the 60s and 70s. Since then, he has performed as an actor for distinguished filmmakers, including Barry Levinson, Roman Polanski, Pedro Almodovar, Steven Spielberg, Martin Ritt, Steven Soderbergh, and Sidney Pollack, and made 160 films, wow, in 3 languages. He served on the California Arts Council during Governor Jerry Brown's first 2 terms and was chairman from 1976 until 1980, during which time the council's budget rose from $1 to $16 million annually and achieved inter-agency agreements to hire artists as corrective problem solvers with 14 state agencies.
Creative problem solvers.
Yes, to hire artists as creative problem solvers. Thank you, Peter, with 14 state agencies. Mr. Coyote's memoir of the counterculture years, Sleeping Where I Fall, published by Counterpoint Press in 1999, has been a continuous release ever since. An early chapter from that book, Carla's Story, won the 1993-94 Pushart Prize for Excellence in Nonfiction. His second book, The Rain Man's Third Cure, also about mentors and teachers, was released in April of 2015 and was listed among the top 5 books in creative nonfiction that year. 2 new books, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Meet Buddha, Using Masks to Create Liberated States, and his first volume of poems, Tongue of a Crow, were released in November and December of 2021. So very prolific. He studied Zen Buddhism since 1974. He was ordained as a Zen Buddhist priest in 2015 and received transmission from his teacher. He's at home in North California. Wonderful, Peter, to have you with us. What a distinguished contribution to our global culture and through the arts and through the books that you've authored. Tell us a little bit, just as we start, and then we'll come to you, Jonathan, to set up and frame today's discussion. But tell us, Peter, what's alive for you right now? What do you think is top of mind, top of heart for you as we begin this conversation on human security, your current projects, current works, current initiative? What would be your opening statement today?
Well, moving from the trivial to the profound, no one calls coyotes Mr. Ben. My name is Peter. That's good enough. So top of mind is there are 2 absolutely existential threats that are unavoidable to all life with respiration. and one is climate change, and one is nuclear issues. The fact that nuclear weapons even exist is the reason that all of Europe and the United States is sitting on their hands and watching Ukrainians be slaughtered. There's no such thing as good guys and bad guys. It's the weapons themselves that determine strategic responses. And the idea that we can coexist with weapons which are designed to blast apart everything that has dividing cells is as foolish as the idea that we can live on a planet with 450 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. And even the zero net of the Paris Accords will not remove a pint of carbon from the atmosphere. People are acting as if, oh, if we get down to zero, everything will be fine. No, there'll be 1 trillion net tons of extra carbon in the atmosphere. The weather will not change at all. And until we take steps to draw down the carbon below 300 parts per million, which was kind of traditional planet temperature for the last several 100,000 years, we're just kidding ourselves. So those two things are top of mind. And my friend Jonathan is more expert than I at pointing out how those issues redefine any notion of security, personal, state, national, or international. So I'm here because he likes me, because we talk about the same stuff all the time.
All right, beautiful. Thank you for laying out those two critical issues. We know that it's something that Jonathan and others have been educating many people around this for some years. So Jonathan, we're here, part two of this discussion around the many dimensions of human security. It's International Day of Peace. You're in New York, where obviously this week the Security Council is meeting, and also it's World Climate Week. I mean, there's a lot of things converging right now. What would be your opening statement today as part of part two of this discussion on the many dimensions of human security?
Well, Peter has highlighted the fact that we've made humanity an endangered species, and we've done it to ourselves. So we need to explore the psychological and spiritual proclivities that have led us into this dilemma. But I want to flesh out a little bit about what Peter highlighted and the relationship between the 13,000 nuclear weapons that are pointed at us. And all that background you hear, I'm actually in the I'm in the courtyard of my office here in 49th Street in Manhattan, and the heads of state of the world are in this neighborhood. And I apologize for forgetting that this could happen. I might move indoors in a little while. But one of the things that you see in this neighborhood at this time of year is very frail, largely insecure, and not necessarily highly evolved political leaders from around the over 190 nations of the world, all coming together with their entourages, believing that they clearly see the ultimate reality in which we live and are competent to handle nuclear weapons and are competent to handle the powers of modern science and technology and its impact on the natural world. And I would just propose that some of the inventions that we've created for ourselves are beyond the competencies of our political institutions. And nuclear weapons are the best example of that. The more we perfect the weapon, the less security we obtain. But there's a social dimension to the weapons that even surpasses the trillions, and I don't mean billions, but I mean it knowingly, trillions of dollars spent on this venture, somewhere around 9 trillion. Actually, and military expenditures since 2000 have hovered somewhere between 32 and 33 trillion dollars. And just think if a pittance of that had been spent to eliminate poverty, to get us off of fossil fuel, to teach people conflict resolution in our schools, to allow foreign ministries and the State Department of the United States to be robustly funded and have enough personnel to negotiate the complexities of the modern world. But we're not doing that. We're not spending money on those things. There is no constituency that is transcending the illusion that a state can operate independently of the rest of the states of the world and effectively protect the climate. That any group of states could operate independently of the rest of the states and protect the oceans, which provides 50 to 70% of our oxygen. That can protect the rainforest that provides most of the rest of our oxygen. That can handle a global integrated financial system. All of these issues transcend national security interests and require global cooperation, multilateral common security. And the term that reminds us of our common humanity, that brings us together to address from daily life issues to the global issue, is human security. That security begins and ends with human beings. And human beings can't live, in the same way as states can't live separated from each other. Human beings are part of the fabric of the web of life, and we're just one thread in the fabric, and we can't live without healthy biodiversity. These are realities. But nuclear weapons are the institutionalization of adversity. And that's why they're sort of an acupuncture point in social change. But I'd like to, I know Peter sort of threw it to me in the area that I'm deeply engaged in and an expert in the instruments, the legal instruments through which states talk to each other. But these legal instruments have recently become dramatically marginalized. And the danger we face is that when the words that constitute agreements between people and countries, treaties, are neglected, then verbs become bullets. And that's the danger where we are today. And bullets in the nuclear age are utterly insane. So this kind of collective insanity that people have come to largely live in denial of and adjust to, I think is a uniquely modern pathology and a uniquely modern kind of insanity that demands psychological and spiritual inquiry. And one of the things that Peter has been an expert in for his whole lifetime has been dramatic movements of consciousness and social change. And recently, in the last few years, he's taken a deep dive into the tradition of Zen Buddhism, which is a very powerful tool for understanding the core personal existential threats that we face, the existential threat of our personal demise, and a methodology for coming into balance with other life forms and other human beings. And I really wanted to ask Peter what he's learned in this journey of personal transformation and insight into the core human security issue, which is the peace of mind of your heart as it faces the limitations of existence, old age, sickness, and death, and the fact that we are both interconnected and dramatically singular.
Well, that's precisely what the Buddha set out to address. And when he returned from his enlightenment experience, he gave a short address to the mendicants that he'd been living with for 6 years. And he had starved himself to the point that he passed out in a ditch. And he was rescued by a little serving girl who was carrying a bucket of rice and milk for an offering to a temple. And she saw this old man dying, and she just spontaneously went and offered him this sustenance and nourishment. And the nourishment and her impulsive generosity taught him two things. One thing was that it's not wise to destroy the body. It's not wise to push yourself to extremes. And it was her impulsive generosity that gave him the forbearance to continue his quest for enlightenment. And when he came back, he explained the Four Noble Truths to people. And I'm just going to repeat them because they're really worth understanding. Basically, he described four things. The first noble truth is It's been translated as suffering exists, but that's actually by Christian translators who put things in a different context. The actual language that he used is much closer to the notion of affliction. And affliction, he described. What is affliction? It's birth, it's death, it's longing, it's disease, it's being separated from what you love, it's being attached to what you don't love. It's not just a mental event, it's physical events. And it happens to everyone. If you're suffering, if you're afflicted, it's not a sign that you're spiritually deficient at all. That's the first noble truth. The second one is called samudaya, and it means arising. And what it means is that when we're afflicted, things arise within us. When someone cuts us off, we get angry. We want to give them the finger. When someone cheats us, we get angry. All sorts of things arise. And that's not our fault either. That's not a symbol of spiritual deficiency. That's just the way things are. If we get too hot, we move away from the fire. If we get too cold, we move closer to the fire. And those two things are just energetics for keeping life in motion, for keeping things moving. The third noble truth is the first one you can do something about. And it's called nirodha. And it means containing. And the image he used was an image that would have been familiar to any Indian peasant. It was an image of a clay wall that's built around a fire pit to keep the flames from leaping out and burning the village or burning the crops. And what he taught was that by meditating and learning about the insubstantiality of your thoughts, your feelings, your impulses, your sensations, and your consciousness, you develop the confidence that you can contain them. And those people who can't contain them are flooding the bars, they're having illicit affairs, they're shopping too much, they're seeking power, they're doing all sorts of things because they're running from discomfort. And once you can contain this energy, and the image that I use is if you spread gasoline on the ground and light it, it does nothing to cause damage. If you put it within the confines of an engine, it does work. So sitting meditation makes us the engine, makes us the crucible that contains all the energy of affliction and arising. And then once you've reached that state, the last level is called marga. It's the eightfold path. And the eightfold path is the way that you model the life of a Buddha to make a dignified and helpful life for other people. Right speech, right practice, right observation. So from that point of view, we are the problem that we're always trying to solve, because there's no difference between us and the nature of the universe. The nature of the universe is half positive and half negative. And so are our personalities, and so are our interior selves, which is the spaciousness that the personality floats in. So if we don't understand that as human beings, we're like radios tuned to the human spectrum, and anything that any other human being can experience or do is liable to come up through us. And if we simply define ourselves as the good guys, we are ignoring half of the universe. We're ignoring the shadow spectrum of humanity. And what happens in that case is we put it on other people. We call them our enemies. And then the good guys wind up bombing hotels in Baghdad in the middle of the night and killing men, women, and children in their beds because we're the good guys. And we've absolved ourselves from responsibility of owning and containing what arises in the mind. So to me, that's the framework with which I look at politics. The second point that Buddha made, and I won't go on, but is that we all have a self-awareness. Eyes have awareness, ears have awareness, mouth, body have awareness, and our self-awareness is the combination of all those proprioceptions. And by being told who we are for our entire lives and implying who we are by the way other people respond to us and figuring out who we are by what we do, we tend to reify this self and turn it into something with the concrete actuality of an organ. And that's the point at which this guide of an ego, which is basically here to help us cross the street on the green light and brush our teeth and take care of ourselves, becomes a warden. And that's the point at which what's actually an awareness, not an organ, an awareness that we share with all other humans and many in the animal and even vegetable spectrum, becomes an agency of division. Because if we really think about who we are and what we want security for, we have to admit that none of us have ever existed without oxygen. None of us have ever existed without sunlight, without water, without pollinating insects, without microbes in the soil. Take it out to the world's location in space. If we were closer, if we were closer to the sun, if we were closer to the sun, water would burn off. We wouldn't be here. If we were farther away, it would freeze. And we're held where we are by all the forces of the universe. So when we think about ourselves, if we don't think about all those interconnections, if we don't think about being part of one big thing, like being ticks on the body of a dog, we have the fundamental delusion of mankind, which is that we are separate, or more aptly, that we are only separate. And so the way that I see security, or the way that, when Jonathan and I talk about this stuff, he's pointed out that if human beings are apparently separate, but also apparently commingled, there should be no contradiction between states and nations being apparently separate and commingled. So that's kind of where my thinking is gravitating.
So one could say that the lessons from the wise to recognize both the uniqueness of your face and my face, and the fact that we're breathing the same air, and that we have a third lung called phytoplankton, can teach us personally, just at the, not even the level of wisdom, just on the level of logic, that like if you lost a lung or I lost a lung, we could live. But the third lung of the phytoplankton, if we lose that, then we both die. So we have an interest in recognizing our interdependence with a natural phenomena independently of our creating, that we are dependent upon, just as we're dependent upon the ants. If the human endeavor were to disappear, the ants will do just fine. But if the ants disappear, our endeavor has about 3.5 months, and then the cycling of the planet, the recycling of biological debris would stop, and we would die. We depend on other species. We depend on them, and they don't depend on us. So we have this arrogance, this extraordinary arrogance, the arrogance of egocentricity that leads us to believe that we're separate from the natural world. And my understanding of Buddha's path of awakening, that the engine for it is compassion. And compassion is the affirmation of the underlying unity of all of us. Because when one exercises compassion, another level of consciousness and awareness is gifted, because the ego diminishes, and then in that space, the miracle of grace awakening occurs, because that's the natural state of the fullness of our humanity. And I was really struck, Peter, by your pointing out that each of us has the potential for total darkness and total awakening. And one of the geniuses of the United States system that we've so benefited from was the humility of building in checks and balances, building into the system oversight, so that no one group of people could have excessive power over others. Now, there are many imperfections in the foundation of our country, such as racism in the 3/5 clause of, or even recognizing owning human beings. It's just a terrible thing that we still carry we still carry that the disease of racism that was there then, that has to be cured. But there was wisdom in it, and the wisdom of limiting anybody's capacity to have too much power. And we're now seeing the danger of the authoritarian model of governance that takes away that check, that allows the moral agency of one individual, whether it's the king or the president, as we had a president who wants to stay president, wants to come back as president, and rule without checks and balances. So I would say in the external affairs between us, the space between us, law and rules are necessary. But in the space within us, the law of the golden rule, of intending for others the goodness that we want for ourselves, of experiencing the nourishment that arises from bringing compassion into action, are the sort of the laws that we have to follow. That if we followed the wisdom that comes from those inner laws, we would say nations will do well to treat other nations as they want to be treated.
So
nations could use the wisdom of the Buddha, the wisdom of Jesus, the wisdom of Mohammed, the wisdom of Socrates, the wisdom of Confucius as principles of governance, rather than the wisdom of militarism, the wisdom of market forces, without the guidance of the wise that have been amongst us, amongst the human community, as far back as we've been telling stories about each other.
So you're a sports fan, so you know that you can't play basketball without rules. And when a quarterback lets some air out of a football for an advantage, there's a huge hue and cry, because everyone understands that you won't have a game if those rules are violated.
Mm-hmm.
Well, America is a game. It's referred to as an infinite game because the goal is not to win, but the goal is to keep the game going. But it's still subject. Once you violate the rules and norms, you're actually ending the game. Once you take away a president's ability to select his own Supreme Court justice, once you refuse to give them a vote on judicial appointments, you are ending the game of America. One of the things that you made me think about when you were talking about compassion, there's a Sanskrit word, which is bodhicitta. And bodhicitta is an automatic arising, which arises upon slipping outside the ego for a minute. You know, when we meditate, any meditator will know it's like turning your ego into a colander. Stuff comes in through the holes, or you drop out the bottom, or you slip out the side, and you get in touch with the vastness that the ego's floating in. And when you see that, and when you understand how everything is in transition, this spontaneous love for the fragileness of the world arises. And I explain it to people by saying that no one has any deep feelings about artificial flowers because they're not dying. But flowers are dying. People are dying in front of us. They're running away from what they fear. They're running toward what they lust after. And it's all based on the fear of disappearing. But they haven't really thought it through, because the thing that I'm made of, I just gave you my little list, which my students laugh at me about. When I start going sunlight, oxygen, they start going microbes in the soil, bees, cow shit, whatever. So those things don't die. So we can't actually say who's living, and we can't actually say who's dying. We're here more like little wavelets in the ocean, little wavelets rising and falling. And when the waves arise into form, each wavelet could be a nameable thing in the universe. Could be a person, could be a mountain range, could be a civilization, could be an idea, a thought, a feeling, an impulse. And we call, when it's a wavelet, we call it living. And when it falls back into the ocean, we call it dying. But what we forget And what the wavelets forget is that they've never not been part of the ocean. So I talk about my living, but I'm excluding the oxygen, the sunlight, the microbes in the soil. I'm forgetting about that part. And I'm trying to hold on to this sack of flesh, which is temporarily hosting awareness, which is not going anywhere when I die. So it seems to me that presidents, world leaders, they are identifying their ego with the nation, and they're replicating the same error of solidity and separation, and they're making strategic calculations based on what is the fundamental human delusion. We do not exist alone. It's just a problem. And none of our politics and none of our foreign policy seems actually based in that ancient wisdom and demonstrably provable thesis.
The difference is your system of Peter has within its certain elements that institutions that are created by law, de jure institutions, states, corporations, don't have.
What is that? I don't understand.
You are a natural being. You're not created by law. You're created by nature.
Okay.
And I am too. And so I have within me, as you have within you, a conscience, something that says, "Oh, I hurt this person. This isn't right. I should fix it." We have a capacity of feeling that the wellness of others, a feeling of directly knowing. Well, Sadi said it, the great Sufi said, humanity is like like a tree, and an injury to any part stimulates a healing response from the whole. It arises from an unseen essence, the ultimate mystery. Oh, you who cannot feel the suffering of others, can you call yourself truly human? So I think this says it very clearly. Part of being human, being a natural human being, is that is the capacity of compassion and conscience. Whereas institutions that we create, corporate businesses or states, the modern state was created to solve the dilemma of the 30 Years' War in Central Europe in the 17th century, where Protestants and Catholics were going to continue slaughtering each other over their definition of Jesus' love. So a bunch of wonks, lawyerly wonks, got together in Westphalia and developed a bunch of written agreements that said, we're going to create Protestant states and Catholic states so they'll stop killing each other. These are things that we created, but we didn't create the thingness of our humanity. There is a thing that comes out of the earth and returns to the earth. That's natural. But we create these institutions, and thus we can recreate them. We create the rules whereby they operate. We create the boundaries. We create borders. The viruses have figured out the borders are artificial. The virus pandemics don't follow the lines of passports. The climate is natural. It's whole. And the human being now, for the first time in human history, this realization that you pointed out of our interconnectedness has now not only become a spiritual realization, a true insight into the human condition, it's also become a practical necessity. We practically can't address the problems that science and technology have caused without the ancient admonition in the Upanishads. The world is one family. And right now we're violating what I think is a very excellent ethical principle. Love people, use things. Don't love things and use people. And so ideologies, or even the definition of the state, is a thing. It's nothing wrong with it, but it's a thing that we've created. And when that thing becomes toxic to the well-being of people, we need to revise the thing. We need to revise how we do it. So here would be an example of what we can learn. At the end of World War I, there was a bunch of legal instruments that revised the organization of the relationship of the states of the world in the Treaty of Versailles. Part of that was we will cause Germany to pay back all of the to pay back the rest of the world for the injury they caused in World War I. They lost, so we'll put some more we'll make them pay up. It was vengeance. Interestingly, at the end of World War II, we had some generals who really saw the horrific consequences of burdening other countries and the consequences of Versailles. And they said, let's have a Marshall Plan. Let's help those countries that we beat. Let's build them. Let's build their economies. The consequence was Germany and Japan become dynamic economies, dynamic democracies, and trading partners. Interestingly, I was thinking, like, today I was speaking at an event in Times Square on International Day of Peace is today. And it was interesting because it's like the center of the weapons of mass distraction. And I was thinking about how wise that Marshall Plan was, how insightful it was in bringing the world together, because I was looking at all the advertisements and thinking, oh, all the fashion stuff, that the clothing comes from all over the world and the cars that were being advertised with. I was sitting there seeing that we can together, we can reorganize. The business community has certainly done that, but we have not.
What?
Yeah, but our definition of security has become based on the illusion that something that we've created has to be the point of reference. The state and the military become the point of reference. I'm suggesting we would do much better if our point of reference was the reality of our interconnectedness as human beings.
Yeah, well, just a funny example. I'm looking at the chats that are going on while we're talking, right?
Oh, look too.
So we're here at Peace Week and people are arguing about what we're saying. Some woman's arguing about Buddha, somebody's saying people are pure, somebody's saying something else. And there's a little case in point. It's like you could be listening and taking notes and analyzing what we're saying and disagreeing with us afterwards. But there's impulse that my little point of view is precious and has to be heard now. And I mean, I suffer from the same thing, but I was invited to be here and to talk. And I just have to laugh because here's a room full of people that are dedicated to peace and harmony. And it's like there's a little vicious squabble going on about definitions of terms. And it's no different from the singular to the national, you know. I mean, you know more about it than I do, but it seems to me that for all its flaws, the United Nations is the only hope we have. It's like, yes, it's a human institution. It's as flawed as humans are, but somehow or other, people are talking. They're not shooting at each other. They're not carrying weapons or slapping each other. And in a world with nuclear weapons, that's a net positive. And so someone sent me this book today or yesterday. It's called Climate Restoration. It's by a guy named Peter Fikowski. And the first thing I read about it, and he's very well known in climate restoration work, but I had no idea, for instance, that the Paris Accords, which are designed to get us down to net zero carbon by 2050, will do absolutely nothing to arrest climate change. We will still have 1 trillion tons of carbon in the atmosphere that will continue to cause this weather disruption for millennia. And unless we are drawing it down, and this book is full of concrete ways, and Paul Hawken has a book called Drawdown, unless we draw down the carbon to less than 300 parts per million, which is the historic amount of carbon in the last several 100,000 years on Earth, we're never going to have predictable seasons, predictable harvests. We're going to continue with fire and floods and quakes. And you would think that would be front page news, but it's my county, my state, my nation versus your county and state and nation. And it all comes from these limited ideas of what a self is and what it identifies with. And the only thing that's missing is the other half of the equation. It's not like yourself doesn't exist, but it doesn't exist independently. And no one wants to talk about the ramifications except people like meeting here.
And it's exactly the same phenomena, as you were saying that, the idea that my state can exist independently of all the states, other states in the world. And we're seeing right now the hazard of that. I mean, we're not ever going to have a state of perfection, and the mind will never be still. And there'll always be a dynamism in the short term of our lives of cleaning ourselves, of we have a duty to scrub and love. We have a duty to scrub and love. That's what we got to do. And the world is not going to be heaven, but we can limit, like as Martin Luther King, I can't make everybody not want to murder me, but I can make sure that there are laws that prevent them from murdering me. But as we know, the law turned out to be insufficient. So no matter what we do, the world's not going to be heaven. There's still going to be murders. There's still going to be wars and problems. That's going to be there. But because those things will continue, we don't throw out the laws prohibiting murder. And so we have to strive toward that perfection. We have to strive toward the highest virtue. That is what causes us to discover that if we, as Muhammad said, we take one step toward the divine, it takes 10 steps toward us. But you don't realize that until you follow what Peter reminded me of as the great Zen koan, just pick up one piece of dust. Just do one good thing, and you'll discover blessings within yourself that you didn't know about if you do that one thing selflessly and purely. And I was highlighting that in the instances of the relations between states, when the United States led in the reconstruction of the world after World War II, everyone benefited. Now we have a paradigm that says, that's based on the Roman axiom, prepare for war, receive peace, prepare for peace, receive war. In other words, peace through absolute military dominance. So we have the strategic command in the United States calling for full spectrum dominance, totally inconsistent with promoting democracy, totally inconsistent with strategic stability, totally inconsistent with the premises of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, and the entire UN system. But we have a section of the government of the United States propounding this, and still clinging to the doctrine of the first use of nuclear weapons, that we could use them first and annihilate unlimited. And why is this? It's largely because the people here who truly care about our human values, we have not passionately educated others of what we know to be the incredible potential of human beings to love one another, the great grace that comes from bringing that into action. And this is a time in which we have to, all of us who really believe in the power of compassion and that the human family is one, we have to collectively come out of the closet. We've got to put these things out into the street. We've got to, because, Peter was very involved in the social transformation in the 60s, in which people did come out in the street and say, let's try and do things, let's experiment. Let's try and do things for free. Let's try and do things for love. Let's set up free clinics and see what happens. Let's give away free food and see what happens. And that changed a lot. And so I wanted to ask Peter his analysis of, because you were right there in the beginning of this. You were there with the San Francisco Mine Troupe. You were there with the first Be-Ins. You were there with the creation of the counterculture. Did we win anything? Did we lose anything from that powerful experiment?
Okay, so I'll tell you that. I'll tell you what I think. But I have to first clarify a nuance about Fuketsu's speck of dust, because I either didn't explain it right or you heard it differently than I intended. Fuketsu was a 13th century Zen master. And I don't know if you know what koans are, but there's certain non-logical riddles that teachers give their students, like what's the sound of one hand clapping? They can't be figured out. You can't get to the truth of them by logic. So Fuketsu gave this koan called One Speck of Dust. And what he said was, if you pick up one speck of dust, the nation prospers. If you don't pick it up, nothing happens. So what he meant was, doing anything next to the vastness of the universe is picking up a speck of dust, creating world peace, saving the last whale, building a Buddhist temple, building a shrine to Jesus, or a Muslim place of worship. These are all a speck of dust. Now, there are some people who can look at the world and they're not impelled to pick it up. They can watch people suffer. They can watch things fall apart and say, well, it's not me. But for people like those of us gathered here, for people like Jonathan and myself, we're impelled to do something. And so Fuketsu's warning is, you have to realize when you pick up a speck of dust, you pick up the entire world. You don't pick up just the good you intend to do. For every good thing you do, you'll do 6 bad things that are unexpected. You get the whole world. So what does this mean? What this means is that you can't just run off enthusiastically and say, oh, we're going to invade Iran and the oil will pay for it and we'll set up a constitutional American idea of a government and it'll be great. No, what you have to do is be like a fox. You have to go in, you have to stop and say, is the situation the same? Has it changed? Do I have to change my strategy? And moment to moment, you try to braid your intention through the ultimately changing kaleidoscopic reality to stay on track. So having said that, what did we win and what did we lose in the 60s? I would say, looking back from 80, that we lost every political argument. We didn't end war. We didn't end neoliberalism. We didn't end racism. We didn't end misogyny toward women. We didn't end intolerance. We didn't end, all sorts of legal impediments to democracy. But if I look at the cultural level, what we did, I would say we won everything, because from the 60s came the fullness of the civil rights movement, the fullness of the women's movement, the fullness of the organic food movement, and from it, the environmental movement, the fullness of alternative health practices, Ayurvedic medicine, acupuncture, homeopathy, naturopathy, the fullness of other religious practices, various Buddhism practices, various Islamic practices, various Christian practices, Wicca. And these are changes that people have been living in their lives. So today, farmers in Nebraska who might have been beating up hippies in 1963 are fighting fracking because it's impeding their organic crops. So culture is a wide, deep pool, but you don't win everything. So now we're still back to the problems we didn't solve, which is you can't play basketball without rules and you can't run capitalism without rules. Unregulated capitalism is just like letting the foxes in the hen house. So we now have to, as old people, as my grandmother would say, altakakers, we have to look and say, what have we learned? We have to learn how to use these institutions and work with them and make our arguments less based on tribal affinities and more based on the common denominators that Jonathan was pointing out, because failing that, the game is over. And, you can accuse us of trying to scare people or whatever. I'll be dead. But here's a problem. My granddaughter's 16. By the time she's 40, living in San Mateo will be like living at 12,000 feet, because a third of the green plankton in the ocean will have been gone. The major oxygen producing organism on the planet, larger than the rainforest. So there is no force on earth that will be able to resist the migrations of hundreds of millions of people looking for grazing land, looking for water, looking for farmland. There's 600 million people in Latin America. When the equator gets unlivable, they will not be heading south. They will be coming here. People in Yemen and Ethiopia and places like this will be moving north, and there are no boundaries, there are no borders on earth that will hold them. So what you're looking at is at first not the end of human life. You're looking at the end of civilization. You're looking at the end of rule-bound, normative-bound, and law-bound civilization. Who will be free? I'm reading about billionaires now who are tunneling into the mountains and they're stockpiling water and 6 months of food and everything. I mean, none of these guys have ever been to jail, because there are guys in jail who will pick the locks of those underground homes, 10 minutes, come in and kill them and steal all their food. So the world is producing fictions of this order and acting on them as if they're fact, instead of dealing with nuclear weapons, the production of burning of fossil fuels. Here's one that's a particular grit in my system. Rex Tillerson, head of Exxon, Secretary of State for Donald Trump, was in the C-suites of Exxon in 1973 when the 16,000 scientists came and said, holy crow, we just found out that burning fossil fuels is raising the temperature of the planet. We have to change our business model. Well, what did the C-suites at Exxon do? They hired the 4 doctors who worked for the tobacco industry to cast shade on the relationship between cancer and tobacco, to cast shade on global warming. And so we lost 30 to 40 years. This is a crime against humanity. He ought to be tied to the Washington Monument and spanked on television. This puts genocide on a whole different scale. And then there was the advertising of the Oil and Petroleum Institute, $1 million a month in Washington to advertise and cast doubt on global warming. So you can see how self-centric, small-time thinking, even for mega corporations, is leading them to extinction. And even when Biden was trying to pass the big infrastructure bill, Senator Manchin never asked for a nickel to retrain the coal miners. Everybody knows coal is going as a heat producing entity, but they didn't ask for money for the workers. They wanted to protect the sale of the product around the planet and keep it going. And we're all riding on that toxic duck. That duck is getting farther and farther from shore. So in nature, the hawk, the swoop, and the rabbit are one thing. They're one thing. So from the big picture, we can say, yes, all these crazy billionaires and stuff, they're just the shape of our fate. It's just Kali dressed up in an Armani suit. So it falls to us to save our own lives by penetrating the ignorance with these kind of facts of our mutual interdependence and what Buddha called dependent origination, which means know this, know that. It's what Jonathan was saying. No oxygen, no people. No water, no people. No sunlight, no people. The last thing I'll say, there was a study done by the Rand Corporation about a hypothetical war between India and Pakistan in which 50 nuclear weapons were released. And they were the size of the weapons at Hiroshima. And the new weapons are 50 times more powerful. Well, those 50 weapons is what taught the scientists about global winter, that those 50 bombs would throw enough dirt, enough ash, enough crap up into the air to obliterate sunlight for a decade. There would be no crops for a decade. And so our leaders are like, they're not paying attention to science. They're not paying attention to anything. They are just gaming within their system. So it falls to us. It falls to the dreamers and the spiritual thinkers to kind of point out in language that won't scare them, won't chase them out of the room, that they're committing slow suicide and they're taking the rest of us with them. And we might not be able to do it.
Mhm.
Might not work.
And it might work.
And it might.
Can I jump in there, Jonathan and Peter? I just want to bring something in, which I think is really resonant. Thank you, Peter, for that. Pretty dire, but I think, substantial analysis. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but a couple of days ago, Amanda Gorman addressed the United Nations General Assembly, and there's a 4-minute piece. I mean, bringing in the arts, like what you've done your whole life, Peter, with the movies and the books and creativity. This just, I don't know, Jonathan, if you've seen this, but I want to share this with you both because
Okay.
I think it's super relevant to everything you're saying, and it's also amazing. So just bringing in the voice of youth, addressing the General Assembly 2 days ago on the track. In fact, it was yesterday in American time, I believe, or at least it was uploaded yesterday. So this is Amanda Gorman. It's 4 minutes.
Oh, Amanda
And
Gorman. Okay.
check this out.
UN Secretary General, distinguished guests, and all of humankind. How can I ask you to do good when we've barely withstood our greatest threats yet? The depths of death, despair, and disparity, atrocities across cities, towns, and countries, lives lost, climactic costs, exhausted, angered. We are endangered, not because of our numbers, but because of our numbness. We're strangers to one another's perils and pain, unaware that the welfare of the public and the planet share a name. Equality doesn't mean being the exact same, but enacting a vast aim, the good of the world to its highest capability. The wise believe that our people without power leaves our planet without possibility. Therefore, though poverty is a poor existence, complicity is a poorer excuse. We must go the distance, though this battle is hard and huge, though this fight we did not choose, for preserving the earth isn't a battle too big to win, but a blessing too large to lose. This is the most pressing truth, that our people have only one planet to call home, and our planet has only one people to call its own. We can either divide and be conquered by the few, or we can decide to conquer the future and say that today a new dawn rewrote. Say that as long as we have humanity, we will forever have hope. Together, we won't just be the generation that tries, but the generation that triumphs. Let us see a legacy where tomorrow is not driven by the human condition, but by our human conviction. And while hope alone can't save us now, with it, we can brave the now, because our hardest change hinges on our darkest challenges. Thus, may our crisis be our cry, our crossroad, the oldest ode we owe each other. We chime it for the climate, for our communities. We shall respect and protect every part of this planet, hand it to every heart on this earth until no one's worth is rendered by the race, gender, class, or identity they were born. This morn, let it be sworn that we are one human kin, grounded not just by the griefs we bear, but by the good we begin. To anyone out there, I only ask that you care before it's too late, that you live aware and awake, that you lead with love in hours of hate. I challenge you to heed this call. I dare you to shape our fate. Above all, I dare you to do good so that the world might be great. Thank you.
I hope you managed to catch that, Jonathan and Peter, but just absolutely resonate with everything that you're sharing. And what an incredible message delivered just in the last 48 hours to the UN General Assembly. I'd love to hear your reflections on that.
Well, it's exactly the points that we're making. I wanted to point out that any of the seed metaphors that try to express the multi dimensions and depth and mystery of bringing virtue into action do not do adequate expression of the experience of taking any step with purity in that direction, in the direction that she's called for, whether it is simply picking up a piece of dust, giving somebody a courteous glass of water, or writing a treaty that stops a war. Virtue cannot be measured. But we do know this, that bringing anything into action at whatever level is personally transformative. And that personal transformative experience, is more important than the performance itself, because that's where our humanity is, within the interior of every person. And that interior value of every person is something she was talking about, that every single person is valuable. And that vision, that core implicit in Jefferson's "we hold this truth to be self-evident," even though at the time it was very imperfect. Men without property weren't included, people of color weren't included, indigenous people weren't included, women weren't included. But today we know it means everybody. And that principle of equality is really, basically having a heart without borders, a heart that reflects the unity of life on the planet. But the way in which our major institutions are operating is ignoring this truth that's glaringly before us, that if we don't recognize the absolute imperative of pursuing human security, of pursuing common security amongst nations, of rendering the institution of modern warfare a thing of the past, Ukraine will just be the beginning of the downfall. So this is a plea to all of my brothers and sisters, whatever skills you have, whatever time you have, whatever passion you have, think of it as a gift that can be magnified and amplified in service to the whole. And I wanted to make sure that I point out something that I highlighted, how we got out of the absolutely dysfunctionality of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, because people were willing to die for eternity, just like people are willing to die for their nations. They're willing to die for religion or races. But there they were really organized and slaughtering each other with, pitchforks and terrible brutality. Could not have gone to the nation state without the Gutenberg press. There wasn't a language that was a uniform language between Lyon and Paris until the press. And then you had a uniform grammar, and national languages and identities could emerge. Today, and it's evidenced by Ben in Australia, Peter in Northern California, me down the street from the UN, all of a sudden we have something more powerful than the Gutenberg press, this internet press, which is made the concept of neighborhood so clearly global, and the admonition of that Jesus gave of how do you get the fullness of this time on earth is to love the great mystery that is the power of love that gives us life with all your heart and all your soul, and like that, or necessary part of that, to love your neighbor as yourself. And I would contend the ethics of that is that a neighborhood today is a moral location and not a physical location. And that integrated co-arising understanding and interdependence understanding, which was always a spiritual insight, has now become a practical necessity. I mean, we are destroying the web of life at 1,000 times the evolutionary base rate. And, Gutenberg showed us we can reprint Bibles and Qurans and Bhagavad Gitas, but every time we destroy a species, we can't reprint it. So for me, this is a cry to stop burning my Bible, stop burning our Bible, stop burning the story that the mystery has given us to live in. It is sacred, it is holy, and the human community, if we don't change, we are denying future generations, future souls, the privilege that we have. And I don't think anybody listening wants that to happen. So I thought this woman's poetic wake-up call was powerful and beautiful. It resonated with me. And I hope you don't mind my rambling in response to it, but I think it was mark on, and I think it's hopeful to hear it and to know that the torch is passed on. It will be burning brightly, and it burns brightly in all of our hearts. I know that what Peter and a group of people did in San Francisco in the 1960s, and what Peter's life has been, is an example of somebody deciding to tread a path of reaching the fullness of humanity in service. And I really thank you and the people that did create that cultural transformation, Peter, because many of us don't understand that it was intentional, that there were people got together and said, how can we stop the madness? How do we stop the racial disease? How do we stop the war machine? And you did a lot of good. And I think the wisdom that you're sharing now is part of that same impetus that you said. Something said, hey, serve. And you said, yes, I'm here. I'll do my best.
You're muted, Peter. You're muted. Thank you.
I have a friend who's a personal hero. His name is David Harris, and he's in hospice now, and he's incredibly courageous, facing his own. And he went to war went to jail as a draft resistor in the 60s. He married Joan Baez. He ran for the Senate, and he's been a kind of moral conscience. And his writing has been moral and ethically centered since the jump. And he has a sentence that he wrote in perhaps his last book, which is that values which are not expressed in action don't exist. Just think about it for a second. Values which are not expressed in action don't exist. So in the 60s, I spent lots of time in rooms with people screaming peace at each other. Mm-hmm. Values which are not expressed in action don't exist. So the only cautionary note I'd like to say about the conjunction between local and global: a virtual community won't deliver soup when you're sick. They won't hold your hand by your bedside. They won't walk your dog when you need it. They won't take care of your children if you're too ill to hold them. And there is a facility of communication that's engendered by virtual networks that makes us feel a kind of intimacy with people, that makes it easy to vent our opinions in a chat room or on Facebook or this and that. But we all live someplace. And in fact, if we are expressing those values in place, we're taking care of the planet. Jonathan is one of those people who has these extraordinary gifts that have propelled him to a very large stage, but it's still his local neighborhood. And he's just taking care of his local neighborhood. And Suzuki Roshi once said, everything's perfect until you compare. If I compared the nature of my affects to Jonathan's, I'd go to bed. I'd pull the covers over my head. But in point of fact, I'm doing everything where I live to take care of the place where I live, giving food to the food banks and counseling 8 or 10 students. And if everybody was doing that, things would be a lot better. So I used to have this friend named John Perry Barlow. He's dead now, but he founded something called the Electric Freedom Frontier. I don't know. He was crazy about computers. I used to fight with him all the time because he thought if we just gave computers to African kids, that it would just end every difficulty. They'd all become entrepreneurs. And I just used to pound my forehead, and just say, come on. So we all have this problem, which is we need to remember that we live locally, and the local is plugged into the planetary. And we have to figure out ways to express our values. And if we don't express them, they can't be modeled. When I first came into the Buddhist vows of like, beings are numberless, I vow to save them, I thought, well, that's bullshit. I'm not going to meet everybody. No way to do that. Well, that can't be true. So I sat a few more years, and all of a sudden one day I realized, oh, wait, that means if I'm consistently looking for the most enlightened relationship with every person I meet, somebody's going to see it and they can model it and they'll keep it going into the future. So I would rather make a sandwich for a homeless guy than I would give a speech about hunger to 10,000 people, because you can see me making the sandwich. And you can take clean socks out to the homeless guys, or a blanket, or a sandwich. And other people will see that and they might model it. So although the problems facing us are global, without a doubt, and we started this conversation, I started the conversation with the 2 existential global threats, I'd like to bring back my close to the most concentrated local expression of your values. Václav Havel once said, there is no law preventing you from being courteous to people. There is no law preventing you from sweeping the street in front of your store. And it was so spot on. It was because from small, detailed acts which stem from courtesy and affection and respect, an entire new world gets refabricated. And you may not live to see it, but you are making of yourself a firm, unshakable foundation when you express your values of affection, tolerance, mutual respect, impermanence in action. And if you don't do that, you've not picked up the speck of dust.
Let me put some heft into what Peter said. And it was, I think it was summer of 1973. I was living with Peter for a month and a half or so by a farm by the Delaware.
Don't tell, Jonathan, don't tell.
And in the late afternoon, Peter would gather some of us and say, hey, let's go bale hay. And we showed up at farms in the neighborhood, farmers, and started baling hay for them for a couple of hours till we were tired. We were having fun. We were doing it. We were young. And they said, well, what do you want for this? And Peter said, no, we don't want anything. We're just doing this. This is what we're about. And we put it into action. And so a few years later, they tried to put a nuclear energy plant in that neighborhood. And Peter was able to talk to the local farmers there, and they stopped that plant from taking place. Well, when we were baling hay, we had no expectation that it could lead to stopping a nuclear energy plant. So you never know the scale of virtue. You never know the scale of it. And so it's really important to bring these sentiments into action. And Peter has been somebody that I know has been walking the talk. During the month of August, I spent the month of August almost every day in the General Assembly and other assembly halls of the United Nations with the 190, some 190 nations parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the treaty in which the nuclear weapon states promised to negotiate disarmament in exchange for stopping the proliferation of the weapons. And that treaty is frayed. No agreements could be made because of what's happening in Ukraine. And the press didn't cover it. None of the press covered the severity of the danger of these treaties being neglected. As Peter pointed out, we have to do more than just stop the pattern of oil addiction and fossil fuel addiction. We have to find ways of reversing the carbon in the atmosphere. We have to stop destroying the regenerative processes of the oceans, which provides our oxygen. These are things that people know the technical solutions. It is not a technical problem. It is a problem presently of political will. So I would urge every single person to ask 4 questions. 3 of them to all of our political leaders. What are you doing to protect the climate? What are you doing to eliminate poverty? What are you doing to eliminate nuclear weapons? And to ask each of ourselves, what am I doing to find the highest, most beautiful love and compassion within myself and bring it into action? And that's a question that we got to ask, all the time. But we have moral agency. And if we don't use the moral agency, then we're complicit with the things that we know are wrong. We're complicit. The change from the belief in the love of power to the power of love is the change we're about. The change from loving things and using people to loving people and using things is what we're about. The change from the military pursuit of security to true human security is what we're about. And there's nothing new in any of this. This has been the human choice since we had our yes and no, the 2 most valuable terms that we have in our lives. And this is the time for us to use the model of the amazing women in this web that Ben has helped create, amazing men, as they've done and so powerfully come forward and said, yes, I'll pick up that piece of dust. Yes, I'll take on an ambitious task that makes no sense, but I feel it in my heart. We're in this together, and we will at least affirm the value of what Senator Alan Cranston used to tell me. He said, I don't know if there's other life forms out there in this infinite universe, but there is a life form in this planet that is able to love. And that senator spent 24 years in the Senate putting that into action. So anywhere, even in the realm of politics, you can find people who are saying yes. So those of us have no excuse. If you can do it in the sewer pit of selfishness, there are even people in Wall Street trying to do it, and there are people on Main Street trying to make sure that there's nobody on no street.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Peter, for a very enjoyable and rich conversation. And Peter, it's great to get to know you a little bit. And
Thank you so much.
just your background, your spiritual grounding, your work in the 60s and 70s, activism, and your wisdom for today. A very substantial conversation on the many dimensions of human security, which, as we know, kind of includes and involves everything we can imagine about all the crises.
Ben, I want to report something good.
Okay, you do have 2 minutes, and then we need to shut this down.
I don't need 2 minutes. 3 weeks ago, the General Assembly of the UN, because of one diplomat, a wonderful, powerful woman from Costa Rica, led in this, the General Assembly declared that a sustainable, clean environment is a human right. We in America, we need to make a clean environment a civil right. We're not there yet, but we now have the principle that it is a fundamental human right to live in a sustainable, healthy environment, which means we have extended human rights to reflect the reality that Peter began highlighting with us, which is we are part of the web of life, because that's what a clean environment means. That's good news.
That's a great way to finish up. Peter, thank you so much for being with us. We hope to see you
Thank
again.
you so much.
And Jonathan, I think
Thanks,
this series of
Jonathan.
many dimensions of human security will continue as we go forward together to re-expand, reimagine, and rewild our own imaginations about what human security can mean and ought to mean. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. I'm going to end the live